this. So I want to talk about a particular problem that seems to be at first siloed in international relations. I want to bring that out and how thinking about history, thinking about sociology, a little bit of psychology, economics can be used to attack that problem in a way that's fresh relative to what its traditional approaches might be. So here what I want to talk about is great power competition, demand and supply in the marketplace for world order. When we hear the words great power competition, the picture that most of us think about is exactly the words great power competition. It's about battleships and missiles sailing into the South China Sea or the Pacific Ocean. Great powers challenging each other. Great power rivalry. And that is indeed the domain of international relations, how so many IR scholars have approached this problem of world order. World order is determined by the contest that emerges from great power competition. And as what the title suggests I'm going to do, I want to try and do this. I want to try and bring this picture to this relatively boring one. It's a picture of demand and supply. It's a picture where there's a downward sloping demand curve and upward sloping supply curve and the horizontal axis. Instead of ships and missiles and naval configurations battling each other in South China Sea, it's world order. Okay. Now to do that, well, gosh, how am I going to do that? Is it really the kind of a big science problem that we need to bring together different approaches? And I want to suggest yes. But I also want to suggest that just like that Singapore cab driver story that I just told you about, their sense of ownership of the Lee Kuan Yew School, there's also a humanities sense of ownership on great power competition and rivalry for world order. It's a kind of human challenge that we know it's in common by so many people because it's the kind of thing that Hollywood makes movies about. Mission Impossible Fallout. Okay, there are many things that happen in this. There's Tom Cruise running from point A to point B, like he does in all his movies. There's guns and things that go bang, and then there's ships and motorbikes and all that great fun. But what, at the end of it, was it all about? The thin storyline was that they had 3 nuclear devices. They were going to set them off in the Himalayas, around Pakistan, India, and China. This would pollute the water and the natural resources, all this, and then this would destroy the world order that had come to exist. Why was this so interesting to these people? And why is it the kind of storyline that would attract so much of a Hollywood audience? I think all of us, not just the international relations people, feel a connection to what world order is. So what I want to do is to draw on that connection, think about how traditional IR scholarships approach this, but then say, actually, economics is not so bad as an approach to this problem. But to get to that, I need to just tell a very quick story of how the world order came to be, that these storylines can be about destroying that. Well, most of us consider the current world order as synonymous with the American century. The American century was a construction that came into being after the Second World War. America, after defeating all its enemies, decided that it was not going to be an imperialistic emperor-type ruler over the rest of the world. What it was going to do was to build a safe, peaceful environment. And it came to be called the American century. And those of you who studied this know that America did not enjoy being dragged into being the leader of the world in this sense. It was dragged kicking and screaming by intellectuals, writers, journalists, presidents who attempted to tell the good story about America's construction of world order. So America set about building an international system that could be the center of, but that it was also inclusive, transparent, rules-based, allowed everyone to participate in it. And just to very quickly relate this back to the neighborhood concerns that we began this discussion with, okay. Public policy in nations can sometimes take the form of a discussion of we need to fix our housing. We need to fix our water. We need to fix our education system. We need to get our house in order. Talking about world order, the community of nations, this grand overarching great power rivalry seems to step us outside of that. Okay. Everyone has to try to come to some reconciliation of why at a public policy school, for more than just intellectual academic reasons, we should be interested in large-scale civilizational issues of this kind. Here's how I think about it. If you are doing nation building and you're worrying about the water resources, the housing, the education, the welfare of your old people, what you're doing is getting your house in order. You're looking out for the termites in your house. And getting rid of the termites, having a good public policy domestic structure helps you build a strong house, helps you build a strong nation. But your house is also beset by typhoons, tropical rainstorms, natural floods, global climate change. There are external circumstances that no matter how much you rid yourself, your house of termites, unless you understand these larger scale international forces, your house, your building, your nation is not safe in a public policy sense. So you need to understand these things. And America told the good story. It told everyone, come be part of this. And because I'm building a system that's inclusive and transparent and rules-based, all the other good things, small nations and big nations are taken care of equally. Because a rules-based system makes everybody treated equally, whether you're large or small. With a rules-based system, you distance yourself from the arbitrary exercise of power. So the way Minister Ong Ye Kung described this a few weeks ago, the rules-based system is akin to that where, as a school child, you walk into the nursery playground for the first time and you worry about being bullied. The international order, world order, the international systems, the rules-based international system, gives you the rules under which, as a small child, even though you are smaller than everybody else in the playground, you will not get bullied. So America's construction of this was hugely welcomed by the community of nations. And it was hugely successful. John Eikenberry, many others write about how American global power was unparalleled. After the Sputnik moment that I described for you of the 1960s, America came roaring back. And through the decades after, there was no challenger to it. Yet, of course, you and I began this discussion about great power rivalry, great power competition, suggesting that there might be such a challenge. But this is where history had gotten us. It was the American century. It was open, inclusive, rules-based, and it brought with it huge improvements in well-being through globalization, international finance, rule of law, and although this is much more nuanced and debatable, Western-style liberal democracy. But this was the construction of world order. What does that have to do with this picture? Well, I hope we can begin. Remember, I said what I want to do is to get us a transition from traditional IR way of thinking to economics and bringing in history and all the rest of this. This is a picture of just supply and demand, but you already begin to see some of the connections. America talking about constructing a world order was its providing or supplying an international system to the rest of the world. And when John Eikenberry wrote that American global power was unrivaled, what he was saying was that there might have been competitive providers, alternative providers to the system that was the international system, to the world order, but all of them faded away. America was left as the monopolist provider of world order. So although this picture seems very remote from how we began, the story that we're just talking about now gets us a little bit in that direction, because we begin to understand the supply curve. The supply curve is about great powers battling it out. But noticeable in this is no mention of the demand curve. What do the other nations want? Well, in the earlier story, the construction of the American century, Truman had a very good, clear idea what the other nations wanted. They wanted a rules-based order. They wanted inclusiveness and transparency. So he set out building an international system, supplying an international system that catered to what the demand curve wanted. he, although he didn't think about it this way, Henry Kissinger wasn't thinking about it this way, he had constructed a supply and demand system. But this supply and demand system has peculiar characteristics. Because some of you here might be from the MIA program. Some of you might have just been taking courses in foreign policy, international affairs. You'll notice that in a lot of discussion of international affairs, not all, a lot of discussion of international affairs, there is very little mention of the demand side of the market for world order. There's a great deal of focus on which nation will be the supplier, which nation is duking it out in the Pacific region, which nation will command the Middle East and North Africa region, which nations get to have regional hegemony over Southeast Asia. But there's very little, all that is from the perspective of the supply side. There's real discussion about the demand side. Now I'm belaboring this, not just because I think it's a prettier picture when there's a demand side. The point I want to get to before we finish in the next 10 minutes is that I want to argue that today, this demand side is hugely important. And I need to convince you that the way the world is today, part of the turmoil that we're seeing, the pullback of Trump from the international system, Trump's undermining the World Trade Organization, the greater voice of Asia, when we see in Lee Kuan Yew School promotional brochures, the rise of Asia, I want us to think about that as the re-expression of the demand side, the reassertion of the demand side. But I need to convince you that that's actually a reasonable thing to do. And the point is, from traditional IR thinking, Kenneth Waltz and others, it is a ridiculous way to think about international politics. So here's Kenneth Waltz from 1979, one of Professor Kong's very distinguished teachers from Harvard University. He's very sadly passed away, but one of the great minds of international relations. In 1979, he said, look, at the end of it all, the fact that I'm talking about the supply curve, that's pretty much the end of it, because it's ridiculous to think about this great unwashed masses of other nations out there, like Malaysia and Costa Rica. Why would we ever want to pay attention to them? It's ridiculous to do that, because what we're doing is we're constructing a model of oligopolistic competition, great power rivalry in the sector of the economy. And the Malaysians and the Costa Ricas just are not interesting. And of course, in saying this, Kenneth Waltz is simply repeating a 2,000-year tradition of IR thinking that began with at least Thucydides and earlier. Because remember, Thucydides very famously said, you want to talk about rights of nations? That is only ever in question between the great powers. Because for him it was the cities, but we translate that into the modern era as the great powers, because the strong, these great powers, they're the actors, they're the ones with agency. Nobody else has agency. The strong do what they can, and the weak, like the Sangkanchil in the battling elephant story in Malaysian and Singaporean narrative, the weak suffer what they must. That is the traditional view. Okay? So if, as an economist, as an observer, heck, as an Asian, I want to argue that the world actually needs to pay greater attention to the things that on the demand side we want. I've got to say, this is not all that's going on in the world. Okay, Thucydides, wonderful writer, wrote about the Peloponnesian War, gave rise to a way of thinking that scholars like to think of as being as realists. Realists are the ones who acknowledge these kinds of truths. Realists are the ones who are realistic. This is the way the world is. And others who like to think that America was doing good for the world are liberals and idealists. It's actually realists who have got their finger on the pulse of the global economy. They're the ones who really understand the way the world works. So whether it's Waltz or Thucydides, or in its modern incarnation, the Thucydides trap, that argues that that first slide that we saw of great power rivalry is only going to lead to international conflict, that's being realist. Now, actually, I can be mischievous a little bit. I didn't come out of this tradition of thinking. I am not a trained international relations people. I have no affiliation or loyalty to these different ways of thinking about the world. But here's the thing, I know economics. And you know, if you want to think about a social science that believes that people out there are mean and despicable and don't care about anybody else and only seek to do good things for themselves, hey, its name is economics. Its name is not realism. So here's the thing. I want to see whether economics bears out this realist way of thinking. And I want to suggest that actually this idea that the demand side is important has always been embedded in even traditional ways of thinking. Because, you know, you go back to the American Declaration of Independence. The American Declaration of Independence talks about the leadership of the government subject to the consent of the governed. It's subject to the demand side, finding what the supply side provides acceptable. So the question I'm asking is the same question that the US Declaration of Independence asked for America, but I'm just going to apply it to the world. Because if America wants to continue its American century, it at least needs to make that consistent with its own ideology on consent of the governed. And I want to suggest that other alternative providers actually potentially might have more of a sense of the pulse of what the demand side wants now than America, the hegemon. Okay, so that's my story. Now the rest of it is just about looking at evidence, looking at history. And so the rest of this we can go through relatively quickly. World order, just to be clear, there's a whole sort of more formal discussion of all this. It sets out a definition of what world order is. And for those who are really interested, there's a translation between traditional world order thinking and the kind of model, markets-based order that I want to provide. So we've got great powers, that's the supply side, we already introduced the idea. All the rest of the international community is the demand side. If you're used to IR thinking on hegemonic stability theory, that's simply a particular theory about the behavior of the monopoly provider. Soft power, for all the wonderful things that it is under the expert hands of Joe and I, is really just about advertising what the supply side wants to provide to the demand side. That's all it is. So I want to translate all of this into just economic terms now. So this is where we come back to this. It's not just an intellectual exercise. I want to argue that where the world is now actually makes it critical for us to think about supply and demand. Okay. And so just to be clear, there are those that some international relations scholars I've given this to say, oh no, you know, there you go again, you economists, way oversimplifying, because world order that you've written here is just a linear thing. Well, and of course, world order is not linear, it's about norms and conventions, how can that be? But of course, it's very easy to generalize that picture and the analysis to multidimensional attributes. Anyway, all of that is just technical background in case anyone is interested. There's technical papers and a book that I'm writing on this. I now want to take us through in the remaining 5 minutes, and then we can open it up to just looking at empirical evidence. Because all of this, my own training as an economist is an evidence-based one. I am primarily an econometrician. So I go and look at data. I'm interested in why evidence and data bear out theories or don't bear out theory. So while all this conceptual reasoning is fun and interesting, at base, I want to look at data. So I want to take us through a thinking about the way the world is, about the way the world order is now, looking at data on shocks to the supply side and shocks to the demand side. What are shocks to the supply side? Well, here's one of them, Donald Trump. Okay. And Donald Trump, in his actions that undermine the international system, that perturb the supply side of what America has provided the rest of the world in world order, is a huge variable on the supply side. And when I said the American century is how we think about world order for the last 70 years, it's not Asia or China or other people who are making the greatest noise about the end of the American century. America's own writers are wondering whether the American century will survive the Donald Trump episode. Now, there are interesting things to talk about here. Those who are economists will say, well, You look at a variable, that's the shock, but is it truly exogenous? Are there yet other shocks that are causing? Is Donald Trump as much a symptom of more fundamental underlying shocks, or is he a cause? Is he an exogenous variable? And there are interesting things to unpack here, but however you want to tell the story, Donald Trump is a shock. And Donald Trump is a shock that has worked its way in a propagation mechanism through America, the extant historical single provider of world order, undermining that world order itself, pulling back on the supply curve. When a supply and demand marketplace has a perturbation on the supply side, that's negative, say, the price of world order rises. People are willing to pay more for world order because there's less of it around now, and the quantity of world order supply is reduced. There's a much greater call in the world for there to be leadership, a leadership that reasserts order to the world. But the way in which is serious, it's a serious observation not to take Trump as the exogenous shock, is because the previous system, the American century, itself introduced perturbations into that international system. There's a well-known narrative now that says globalization, America's competition with the rest of the world, has led to an undermining of its labor market, has led to its the relatively disadvantaged within American society no longer being able to compete with the rest of the world. And all of that is, of course, correct, whether you call it globalization or much more simply, that when you open up your borders to trade, your people start competing with the people in all the rest of the world. Your workers compete with workers of the rest of the world. If you are a rich country, the poorer parts of your country will be considered relatively rich, well-paid, high-tech relative to the rest of the world. Global business, if it can replace relatively rich workers with cheaper ones in Cambodia, Vietnam, China, Southeast Asia, what that will do is tend to draw down the wages of these people in the West and tend to increase wages of those of us who live here in Southeast Asia. And that is in fact what happened. That is perhaps the more fundamental mechanism, and Trump, the dissatisfaction, the rise of nationalist populism is just a symptom. Okay, so that's the supply side, and you can expand what that supply side looks like. I now want to finish up by looking at some of the shocks on the demand side, and then looking at some historical episodes that again point out how the demand side actually matters. And the point I want to get to is a policy point. All of this is interesting academically. The policy point is, I want to argue that actually the world is now at a stage where the supply side is precarious, the demand side has risen, and some resolution of these changes on supply and demand needs to emerge. And if America is not willing to supply that world order, it needs to respect that there will be other providers, because there will be a vacuum in the way world order functions. Okay, so there's a policy point here, and unless we resolve that policy point, no matter how much smaller nations look out, try and disgorge termites from the nation-building public policies that they are in the midst of, there will be floods, tropical storms, cyclones, tornadoes. Okay. So what's happening on the demand side? I want to point to three things. I want to point to Asia's rise, two manifestations of that, and then a statement about voice. The first thing, and so coming back here to this picture, it's a story now about the demand side. So with apologies to Kenneth Waltz and Thucydides, I think the world has moved on from 2,000 years ago and from 1979, where actually it now makes sense to think about what the other nations do. So here's a first sense in which it is appropriate to see what the other nations do. This is a graph that shows the ratio between the combined GDP of 180 emerging nations, traditional emerging nations, to the G7, the traditional richest Western economies, including Japan. So this ratio can, of course, be any positive number. It bounces around. what is worthwhile noticing about this? Worthwhile noticing about this is that from 1980, and actually going further back, from 1980 in this graph until the year 2000, this ratio stayed roughly constant at about 1/3. What does that mean? It means that you combine the economic activity across almost 200 nations, you add them all up, and then you go look at the combined economic activity of the 7 richest nations, the G7, that ratio remained constant at about 1/3. This is at first a little bit of a surprise because remember, the 1980s, the 1990s were full of stories about how the emerging nations had come into their own. This was now the time of emerging nations. This is the miracle of emerging nations. But the truth of it is that for all these decades, however fast the emerging nations grew, the developed nations, because they were bigger, more mature, so much larger, just by growing the way they did, in total size, they kept pace. So the story was status quo from just after Kenneth Waltz wrote that phrase, that paragraph, to the year 2000. But then 2000, something very profound broke in the world. Well, depending on your perspective, either broke in the world or got fixed in the world. Because from the year 2000, this ratio suddenly began to climb, and it looks like it's never going back. So as of last year, the emerging nations now have a combined economic footprint that's as large as the traditional G7. The world is no longer the way Kenneth Waltz saw it. Here's a second depiction of that. For most of the 20th century, for all of the American century until recently, the center of gravity for the world's economy sat in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. So the center of gravity of the world's economy is not something that's traditionally reported by IMF or World Bank. It's a calculation that we can all do. You look at where economic activity is located on our planet. So if the global economy was 50% in New York, 50% in London, then the world center of gravity, of course, is exactly halfway between them in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. If New York starts to rise faster, then the world center of gravity gets pulled towards North America. But in 1980, the world center of gravity sat, to nobody's surprise, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean because it kind of balanced the great economic activity in North America, the great economic activity in Western Europe, and a little bit more noticeable economic activity in Japan. And for all those decades, nothing moved the needle. But then, from 1980 on in the decade subsequently, with a speeding up because of this 2,000-year effect, over the last 35 years, the world's economic center of gravity has been pulled east, yanked east by the rise of China, yes, with continued strength of Japan and the rise of Southeast Asia and the other Asian nations. So when Kishore writes his book, The New Asian Century, he documents a range of activities in which this happens. This is simply one small slice of what Kishore has told the world. This comes from a calculation about how the world's economy is changing, and there's no going back. Yes, in the early period, this bounced around because starting out from 1980, then we had the Asian financial crisis and the West grew, and then the center of gravity got pulled back. But for most of the last several decades, there's no going back now. As of last year, the world center of gravity sat in the Arabian Peninsula, in Middle East, North Africa. Of course, it's not that it's because there is where everything happens. Far from it. Just like in the 1980s, when the world center of gravity was in the Atlantic Ocean, it wasn't because there was a lot of activity in the Atlantic, it was because it balanced off North America and Western Europe. Now, the balance is shifting east to a point where in the next 20, 30 years, if these trends continue, the world center of gravity will be in GMT +8. It'll be in this time zone. It'll be on the boundary between India and China. Final thing, final piece of evidence, voice. All of this is about what many of my political science friends say, oh yeah, no, this is just crude economics, doesn't really mean anything, because it's not about where people have political power, say things. Well, here's the interesting thing. If you expand the franchise of democracy, What you really should be concerned about is not where people live, not the color of their skin, not how well off they are, not their nationality, and actually, I would argue, not even the nature of the political system of the nation they live in. Extending the democratic franchise means respecting humanity. And if you respect humanity, you ask, where is humanity seeking to solve public policy problems? Where are the most urgent problems that global public policy needs to solve? So you can imagine trying to address that in different ways. The way that I tried to address it was I asked, where in the world is the greatest concentration of population? Okay. That's a different question than asking where in the world is population most dense. Population is most dense probably in Times Square in Manhattan on a Saturday night. Humanity is packed all in together. Population is most dense on a street corner in Mumbai. Population is most dense on line number 13 in Beijing's metro on a Monday morning as everyone tries to get to work. That's where population is most dense. But this is a different question. This question is, where do you find people most compactly pressed together so that they articulate a simple 50% majority? So that if the world were actually serious about expanding the franchise of international order to solving global public policy problems, this is where it ought to come look. Now, there are different ways you can put together 50% of the world's population. You can go to North America, collect up its 400 million people, then go to Western Europe, collect up about the same number, and then visit Brazil. Then you've got 50% of the world's population. This is not asking how can you randomly, with a political agenda, put together 50% of the world's population. This is asking, if you don't look at national boundaries, you don't look at people's political systems, you just ask, where are people so packed together that you get 50% of the world's population in as small an area as possible. So this, the world's tightest circle, where you get a 50% majority of the world, is actually here. It's a circle that's centered in Shan State, eastern Myanmar. It's 3,300 kilometers in radius. It covers only 1/6 of the world's land area. So in a sense, it's small, but in the population democratic voice sense, this is where the action is. Okay. So there are 3 demand-side reasons why you would think the world order needs to shift. Now, all of this might be, okay, I'm a realist. There you go again, doing wishful thinking. You're doing sort of the liberal way of thinking what ought to be. Can small states actually have agency in how they affect the great powers? Now, I've run out of time, so I won't do this now, but there's a range of historical examples that my research team and I have been putting together that shows how across history, small states actually, by being shrewd in how they behave, have actually been able to affect the actions of rich states, of large states. Maybe this just goes back to Peter Katzenstein, but I think that it's a little bit different from the way Katzenstein expresses this. So let me finish. What have I done in this bit? Well, I've tried to do a little bit of a methodological thing, because remember, my point in this was to try and argue that our school, all schools of public policy, are going through this Sputnik moment. We all have to stop being a poor man's economics department, a poor man's management and leadership program. We need to do something that's distinctively ours. What's distinctively ours is how we solve problems. We solve problems by bringing together ideas from many different disciplines and areas. We do the big science approach to our Sputnik moment challenge. But then I tried to show you how by expanding the franchise of the way you think about important problems, you can get to outcomes that not only are empirically relevant, policy-wise important, but also quite, in my view, quite interesting from an academic journal's perspective. Because this is a kind of rethinking of world order that traditional journals in either economics or international relations will not have done. But by trying to think about an important real-world policy problem, my hope is that this kind of work can also show us, open up new areas in which our academic research can be enriched. And in all of this also, it reinforces a message that I've always taken from founding Dean Hisho, ever since I first met him decades ago, that Asia's place in the world needs to be thought about carefully. We need to be realist about this. We need to make the intellectual argument. We cannot just moralize and say it is time for Asia, because the world is not going to listen to moralistic arguments. The world is going to listen to academic, evidence-based arguments. So thank you very much for your attention. I think there's time for questions. Yes.
Thank you, Professor. So I can see that my 4 years of training in economics can be used in different...
Yes. No, you and I, we are making economics great again.
So, like, I have 2 questions. So from Basic Econ 101. So because your model, it seems like it's a kind of like oligopolistic in nature. So are the players in your model price makers? And if they are, how are the price makers? Secondly, it's like, does this model have like any sort of externality?
Yes, excellent questions. Those I think of as extensions of the basic framework. So I begin by hypothesizing that we can model the supply side as a supply curve. Then unpacking it will take us into oligopolistic game theoretic descriptions of what the supply side really looks like. And then that's when we get to some really interesting, funky things, because global public policy is about solving global public goods problems. It's about solving problems of externalities, problems of spillovers, international epidemics, consumer and lender of last resort, stabilizing the international financial system, writing down the rules of the game. These are actions by a single agent that then have implications on everybody else in the system. One of the things we know about externalities is not what is sometimes non-economists say, oh, if it's an externality, everybody will free ride, it doesn't get done. That's not it. With externalities, not enough of it gets done. Not enough global public goods get provided. So that gets to a much more interesting extension of this, where we go beyond just the marketplace supply and demand, and we try and understand the externalities. I know the endpoint that we will get to. The endpoint that we'll get to is where you think, okay, I can write down the social welfare maximizing problem that incorporates externalities. That's the outcome we should try and get at. What is the mechanism design that we need to do so that we can build global institutions that will get us there? So that's a whole other set of problems. So there's a whole lot of work to be done here. You're absolutely right. And I was kind of kidding about making economics great again. But look, the fact of the matter is, most of us, after the 2008 global financial crisis, said, oh, I'm done with economics. It really destroyed the world. It brought the world to almost insane implosion. How can we ever trust economists again? Well, you see, actually, a lot of economics is about tools like demand and supply, like thinking about great powers. They've got huge application outside of whether you think financial markets are a good idea or not. So this actually says that economics has lots more mileage to go in talking about these kinds of problems. The kinds of questions that you address would be a natural set of questions for international relations scholars to address. The tools that they have are not the same as the economist tool. So there's an interesting dynamic to be uncovered here. Yes?
Professor, in your opinion, is the trade war a new Cold War with new economic weapons? Mm-hmm. And can it be as long as it was the previous one and mostly as dangerous as it was the previous one?
Okay, excellent question. And of course, a trade war is sort of part of the set of tools that competing nations can deploy against one another. So speaking to the specifics of the current trade war, I think that although a lot of discussion is about the economics, the exchange, most economists have the view that Navarro and Lighthizer and the Trump team are pushing on things that aren't actually very meaningful. The trade deficit, inefficiencies in China's system, all of these things actually are either irrelevant or they actually ate the United States. So here's Liu He when he was in the White House, right? So part of America's thing about the trade war is that, oh, we've got to get China to stop using its state-owned enterprises because that's unfair competition. Economics tells us that when you deploy state-owned enterprises, you might get a short-term advantage, but in the long term, that creates inefficiencies in your system. So actually, when Trump says that they want to get rid of state-owned enterprises, it's actually helping China accelerate to a better system. But not just that. Liu He, at one point that I don't know if anybody else noticed, and Trump was saying, okay, we need to get China to buy more from the United States. And Liu He said, yes, I will tell my state-owned enterprises to buy more from the United States. So, he's actually going to use the state-owned enterprises to help reduce America's trade deficit if that's what America wants. So my hunch is that everything on the trade and economic side, China will readily agree to. No problem. Things that get a bit trickier, intellectual property rights, technology transfer, control of technology. So let's take these in turn. China is already ahead of the United States in many of the most important technologies going forward. Quantum computing, cryptography, digital transactions, financial fintech. China is already ahead on this. So the notion that America still has intellectual property to protect, to hide from China, is actually a bit ludicrous at this stage. There are lots of other things, like maybe repairing of soy milk processing plants. All of that will be fine. And so China will again agree to this very readily, because it's actually the weight of advantage has already moved in the other direction. America is thinking 20th century trade when China's already moved on to doing far higher tech issues. So that's on the tech side. It will still be an interesting unfolding, but my impression is China actually got the upper hand on this, and it's playing a good game. It's paying mind to the discourse as it emerges and grudgingly agreeing to things that it actually wants to happen anyway. So there were some other things in your question, but maybe we'll come back to that. There seem to be others, so we'll come back to some of these other things. So I think you had your hand up for quite a while, and then I'll come around to the front. Yeah. So, yeah, go ahead.
Dean, thank you very much. My question is, when I was studying in my undergrad, one of my profs used to always keep repeating this line during his economics class: "When America sneezes, the whole world catches cold."
Yeah.
Now, I want to just pause for a moment here. I know off late we discussed, Chinese challenging the American supremacy and everything. But for a moment, if I pause and if I look at it in a different perspective and I ask you for your opinion, is the world ready in the first place for something where there is no American dominance or hegemony? And what I mean by this is, I'm taking away the tech part and the rest aside. I'm talking about the stability that America also brings in as a big brother, because be it in the international relations, be it in the diplomacy, or be it in terms of being a grant giver to many countries in the world.
Okay. So let me take up this point. We got started talking about the trade war and it became U.S.-China. You'll notice that in my presentation, I did not mention that how the world order that emerges is one that works for the international community, whether it's China or some other supplier. The story, the model, as it were, is blind to that. It doesn't identify winners like that. In terms of your question, America has, for the last 70 years, told us a story that as hegemon, as benevolent hegemon, it provides all these public goods to the world. It is consumer of last resort. If the world economy is in a dip, it'll come in and do that. Of course, that wasn't very successful for it in the global financial crisis. It was actually China that was consumer of last resort. It's the investor of last resort. It's the financier of last resort. It regulates financial markets. It is the world's security officer. It's got the best science. It is the world's everything, right? So that's the hegemon. Now, this model of one, say, of providing goods says that actually we don't care who provides those goods. All we care about, all the demand side cares about, is that those goods are provided. America has told us, has given us a model of world order where the supply and demand intersection is a single provider, not just of a single commodity, but of all commodities in world order. So my question at this point is, if we get the opportunity to rethink world order, to rethink the intersection of demand and supply, we want all the things that America used to provide: sensible regulation of international financial markets, consumer of last resort, world security officer. Maybe we should think, did America do such a good job with being a regulator of financial markets? Well, actually, 2007 housing mortgage crisis in America, maybe not so good. But hey, you know, because they're the hegemon, they get to do that even for us. So that international bankers can sometimes become just a compliance officer for the President of the United States. We are the ones doing what they want. Maybe we don't want that. Okay? So my view is, you want world order? Let's break it out into the tasks that are needed to satisfy what the world wants. You want international financial regulation? Come to Singapore. This is where the expertise is. But then someone will say, but you're not hegemon. How can you be the regulator of international financial markets? And my response is, why do you need an aircraft carrier to regulate financial markets? Why does the hegemon who regulates financial markets also have to be the world security officer? It seems to me those are two completely different things. I want international financial markets regulated well. I want MAS and company to do it. When Mars invades our planet, I want America to be standing in front because it's got all the weapons that will defend our planet. When there's a rogue state that threatens our neighbors with nuclear conflagration, America needs to be the world security officer. But there's no need to overload the function onto just a single individual. So our our trade war discussion inevitably leads to, is China ready to be the world's leader? And I would have the same issues with China being the hegemon as I do with the United States. What we want is a sensible system that provides global public goods. It doesn't have to be a single state that does that. We can be like a civil service. We can provide different kinds of, nobody says that we should have a single ministry that provides all kinds of public policy formulation. We have defense, we have home affairs, we have Ministry of Finance, we have Ministry of Manpower. We can devolve all of that. So it seems to me that if we get away from the machismo-driven approach to international relations, where a single nation has to be the leader, I mean, it's very school childish, It's like you go into the school playground, and then you look around to see who's the biggest kid. And the biggest kid is the one who doles out the sweets and, is the teacher's. We've grown beyond that, and we need to make political science and international relations sensible in that way. Okay, there are lots of questions, but I know you had questions, so go ahead.
So it's very interesting to talk, thank you, but I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to question here. But I'm going to go back to where you started about the school and the school's role, about public policy education. So it seems like you said it's a mix of economics, political science, and some of that. So I feel my question is more about, do you believe that it's still a generalized degree, or can it be specialized? Because even MBA is generalized, but it has its specifications. And just to add that NUS has a very old history and we have established departments. So is it possible to not reinvent the wheel here, do those things there and do more specialized public policy here?
No, you're exactly spot on. When I said, I don't want the school to be a poor man's economics department, it's exactly that sentiment. We shouldn't be reproducing what disciplinary-based departments already do. The question for us is, are we generalists? Are we some weighted average of all of these things, and we're just looking for the best weighted average? My answer is no. What we do is we solve problems. We scan the horizon for the challenges that will be important to the nation and to the world, and we set ourselves a task of addressing those problems. We are problem solvers. Public policy is, it has a side of engineering to it, which is a problem-solving one. Okay, yes. Yeah, yourself, and then I'll come in front again,
To follow up the disruptive technologies topic, we've seen like some big data that leads to nation states being more centralized. For example, in China is like managing to be more centralized by means of this big data thing.
Yeah.
And also we can see the blockchain, which is lead to the certain system to be more decentralized. So I'm wondering, this kind of technology will it lead to the international order to be more centralized, like some hegemonic system previously, or some decentralized system like the Chinese government is advocating for the democratization of international relations?
Yeah, or it could lead to a fragmentation of the world order in the internet space, certainly in cyberspace. There's already an emerging view out there by many writers that say that the control of data will be hugely significant to how world order evolves from here. That's a very ambitious undertaking as well, but you know, that different geographies have different approaches to data management is, I think, one of the facts, one of the well-established facts already. And it's not clear who's got the best way to do this. America, the West, large parts of the West, have an approach that says that the companies are the ones that are the ultimate repositories and owners of the data. So, you know, what Apple gets on its iPhones, off of our iPhone usage, is never made available to the US government. They will fight tooth and nail over that, even though Ed Snowden told us that boundary is not as hard a boundary as one might think. In Europe, the data protection acts that we've seen come through make it very clear that Europe's approach is that the individual has ultimate ownership over these data. And I don't necessarily want to mention specific nations, but in Asia generally, Asian societies generally are more lax about how the nation state can be the one that is the repository and manager of our data. And we don't have to look very far around our neighborhood to already see that. I mean, yes, China, but also in this neighborhood. So there's potentially a fragmentation of the world's internet data understanding across geographies. And it's not clear to me that one is necessarily superior. I know that there's, in a lot of the press that we see, much is made of the social credit rating system in China. Okay, somebody's been antisocial in specific ways, and then the government steps in and gives them a rating, and they can't do anything further, until they can clear that. And that seems to many of us observers in the West so awful a thing to happen, that the state should have such power. Well, interestingly, the manifestation of that in Western popular culture is not a demonization of the Chinese system, but it's a demonization of trends and feeding frenzies in Western culture itself. The open system is not immune to the kind of misjudgments that can occur. And here's one very concrete example. Many of you will be fans of the TV series Black Mirror. Black Mirror has an episode where everybody is on social media, everybody is always rating each other. So you go to the coffee stall, they're rating you, you're rating all your friends. And then through a series of accidents, this very nice person suddenly goes from a 4.3, which would allow her to get a good, sensible mortgage, to under 2.7, where she will no longer be served even at McDonald's. Through a sequence of events that doesn't take any kind of centralized planning, just one thing after another in social interaction through a feeding frenzy kind of activity. So I think that going forwards, we need to be very clear about how we manage these things. In economics, there's this idea of the fundamental theorem of welfare economics, that if you have an open market and well-established property rights, then the outcome that emerges is a good one, is an optimal one. Here's the thing, there's no counterpart of that in any other social science, not in political science, not in any studies of democracy. So all of us, whether we live in democratic systems or not so democratic systems or responsive authoritarian systems, at this point, it seems to me, given the state of knowledge in social science, we're all just winging it. We're all just trying to see how it works, and no one has a good handle on this yet. Okay, I know you want to ask a question, and then Isabel, I'll come to you. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Dean, for the presentation. This is the question that I always keep asking myself, so perhaps I will pose it to you to see what you think about it. When we talk about the world order lead, we also should look at the global challenges that we face.
Yes.
But if you look at the West, for instance, UK and US mainly, those were the ones that right after the World War defined the world order. Now, today, if there's a crisis in Asia, let's suppose immigration, let's suppose security and stability, it is actually the West or US mainly who is the first responder. And maybe that's why one of the reasons that everything that happens, the first country that the Asian countries look high up to is the United States. But despite the fact that we have associations like ASEAN, we have China as an emerging global leader, but the kind of response that we expect to see from these associations or this country, we have not seen it yet. Perhaps that's why we still have that dependence over the West. So what does it take for China or ASEAN, or what kind of role they can play in order to step up and to replace,
Yeah, you're right. Perhaps, perhaps part of the challenge, as it were, is that the alternatives to the traditional hegemonic nations need to step up more to convince not just themselves, but those around them, that it's actually okay to transition to a world order where the hegemonic center does not have to be transatlantic. There's a bit of a chicken and an egg problem here, because if you see, a challenge among, you see a humanitarian crisis, a real humanitarian crisis that we want to be, that's cleaner examples. Humanitarian crises emerge. Actually, the recent history of humanitarian crises has seen first responders from this region itself, right? It's when there are challenges that might spill over into what many of us perceive as great power rivalry, that I think others stay back, that the great powers duke it out still. That's not healthy, but I think I might quibble a little bit with whether the rest of the international community of nations don't themselves step up. I think they do. And I think that someone else, maybe Francesco, maybe you can help me on this. I think that it's now China that has the greatest number of volunteers in a UN force out there in the rest of the world. Maybe Martina, maybe you know as well, that it's now China rather than the United States or the Western powers that's doing the heavy lifting on that. But of course, all of these are just different pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. To be very clear, I'm far from suggesting that we simply replace one hegemonic system by another. I think that that's just as dangerous. But what I want is that we be able to move to a system that allows us to discuss the challenges that we're solving without constantly looking back to the single nation. Leadership should move away from thinking that it is about their coming in and doing everything, or they're imposing their will on us, but it should be about, leadership is just about calling the meeting so that the rest of us can then get together and have a good conversation about this.
Yes, thank you. I have two questions which try to connect your presentation to the topic before of where we're going as a school. So you mentioned we don't want to be poor man's economics department. We want to be more interdisciplinary. So how would you fit an interdisciplinary approach to your model? Because it seems to me that the demand and supply model is quantitative, but what you're actually talking about is a qualitative change in world order. And you mentioned it yourself, so it's not like that it's becoming less, but from a IR perspective, it's becoming multipolar, and then sociological perspective can also shed light. You said the norms, so legal, how does that fit? And it connects to your fourth point, which is on the slide, what leadership does Asia offer? And in that sense, what leadership does this school want to teach? And your question about good governance, so what is our school's concept of good governance? Is it only anti-corruption, or is it accountability and innovation, inclusiveness? And in terms of being ready for global and for the future, so topics as gender and sustainability beyond just cities, because as my colleague just mentioned, so we want to do this globally, not just for Singapore. So how do we combine this and make it truly interdisciplinary so we move away from just the economic perspective?
No, those are all excellent points. I mean, a lot of what you've said are not things that are necessarily the question I have to respond to, because I agree with them. They're all very sensible. A there's a narrow part, probably perhaps the narrowest part of what you say, which is, just how interdisciplinary is this that I'm talking about. And, I think that this is all a sliding scale. There's never going to be too much or too little interdisciplinarity. It's just we do what we can with the problems that we're confronted with. So for me, the intellectual example that's interesting here is that it takes a very classical, established, well-known problem that many, the brilliant minds in the profession have thought about and talked about different instances of it. And then this is just sort of a way to say, well, there's an alternative perspective that we can develop that actually you yourself have already been tinkering about, but that is actually materially important at this stage in the world development that we expand this. So it is those lessons. Now, in terms of the other things that you say about what the school should be doing, I completely agree. I think we should be expanding the range of issues that we're looking at. Absolutely. Okay. Yes.
Thank you, Dean. I want to take you back to the question of a school's role in global public policy education. I think this year is the 15th anniversary of our school, maybe even more 2 decades of the public policy program. So I think students, alumni who graduated before us can be proud of the history place that the school is. And I'd like to hear your thoughts about the next 15 years of the school, where we become the alumni and look back at our school and see where the school is at. And of course, I'd like to lead you to a piece I wrote that I tagged you, I think you like. I'm not sure if you had a chance to read it, but also the role of our school in educating public policymakers, and by and large, Singapore as the educator of the world.
I like that. I like the vision that you started out with, both in what you say and in your article that you had circulated yesterday. It envisions an ambition for our school and for Singapore that is very consistent with, because sometimes the joke that I say is, why would you need an aircraft carrier to regulate financial markets? And what you point to is that here's another area where it's the power of ideas that will really carry us forwards. Education. We can be a global hub for education, provided we set up the right infrastructures, take the right perspectives. That can be a wonderful comparative advantage for the way we operate. So I'm in complete agreement with that. How do I see the school playing a role here? The school works, the school has a lot of autonomy and independence, but we're also part of the educational establishment here in Singapore. We're part of the National University of Singapore, and the Ministry of Education has oversight over all of us. But that gives us a lot of flexibility in how we approach the kinds of problem domains we want to set up for ourselves. How do I see the school going forward? I want the school to continue to be filled with bright, inquisitive people who ask questions, who ask awkward questions, and who take back the best ideas that we've developed here and see how they might be applicable to improve the well-being of wherever they've come from. I want the school to continue to be international and outward-looking in that way. That's part of what the school has always been.
Yes. Thank you for having me and creating a space for open communication. As an MPP junior, on behalf of a few MPP juniors, I'd like to make a suggestion. It would be really great if we can have a few more electives, especially focusing on education, gender, law and governance and technology. Because a lot of us are interested in these, and I feel like they're very important areas of policy interest. It will just help to have a narrow view into that.
A number of the things you mentioned have been high priority on my radar and on my management committee's radar for a long time. And we're trying to do the best we can, getting the technology dimension here moving. On the education side, of course, Andy Francis Tan is single-handed, nearly, but we've got a good group of people around, and we'll try to build on all of these things. It's very valuable to us to get a sense from you where you think the problem domains are going to be the challenging ones going forward. Because we have our own view, but of course that's a view that wants as much information input as possible. So I welcome those kinds of conversations. Thank you. Okay, I think I've kept you for way long enough, man. But I want to thank you all for your attention and your questions. Thank you very much.